Hey, welcome to the Well Bible Reading Journey podcast. This is week 45 already. Can you believe it?
That is wild.
It is
It's just
wild.
flown by. We're almost to a full year.
It's crazy to think
Wow.
that this time last year, this was just like a dream.
It was a seed in Ellis's mind.
Exactly. It wasn't even in my mind yet, not until mid-December.
Right.
Yeah, it's
Right.
crazy. But we're here, week 45. Ellis is not with us this week, but we thought we'd try something new where we get to have more of a conversation back and forth. So if you can't hear us as well, or if it's a little awkward, it's our first week, so bear with us, and we'll make adjustments as we need to.
But give us feedback. We want to play with this and make sure it's working for everybody. And if it doesn't work, we'll go back to the way we were doing it or try something better.
Absolutely. So we definitely want your advice. But in this week's reading, we are going to be in Deuteronomy 4, 5, and 6. We're going to continue the Deuteronomy scroll, our last scroll. I like to talk about it like this. So the Deuteronomy is the last book of the Torah. So here we are. We're talking Torah again.
Yeah.
I like to talk Torah. What about you?
5 times.
We're talking Torah. And then we're in Psalms 44, which we will get to this week. And we're in Mark 16. So this is what we're going to be in this week. And I'm looking forward to our conversation.
These are jam-packed chapters, but not only in Deuteronomy, but we're actually going to pull in some of the Psalms content, and we'll see how that ties to the last chapter in Mark as well. We're ending up with Mark, and we'll see where he ends.
Yeah, it's good. So we're starting Deuteronomy and finishing Mark, and it's going to be, I think we're going to Luke next.
I think so.
Yeah, I think you're right. Awesome. Well, why don't, Craig, you kind of start us right where we left off last week in Deuteronomy.
Yep. All right. So apologies as I look off screen, I have some notes that I can't remember it all in my head. So you probably noticed me looking around in the previous formats up and down. That was me on the notes, but now it's off screen. So, but as we get into Deuteronomy 4, we're heading into a new section of Deuteronomy. We've had the historical recollections that Moses gave to the people. Now he's getting into more of an exhortation session where he's going to lay out really the pillars of Israel's life as a nation and what their faith in God is dependent upon. So as we get into chapters 4 through 11, we're going to see a section in itself of Deuteronomy that really composes, starting in chapter 4, Moses is going to build upon kind of step by step who Israel is, and that is based upon who God is. And a lot of that it had to be set in the first 3 chapters because they have to tell a story of where they've been and remind themselves, and we'll get into that a little bit. But a lot of who that story is important because God identifies who he is, one, in relation to Israel and his people, and two, what he's done through invading history for them. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I'm also, by the way, the God who rescued you out of Egypt and out of bondage and through the Exodus. And so here we get, they're on the precipice of the new land, the promised land. And he's going to set up, this is why it's important to remember who you are, who I am, and what my law is. And that's so, 1, so you may live, and 2, that you may live long in the land I'm about to give you.
Yeah, Craig, that's really interesting when you were talking about living long in the land. I actually had this thought this week. It's interesting as someone who's reading backwards, it's easy for me to make the connections of these people entering into this land and God's laws and covenants with him. It's supposed to give me a pattern or some sort of something for me to hold on to in my life. So when I enter into my promised land, which is eternity, like this is how I live with God, live in God's will, so I can enter eternity. So for my eyes, I'm able to see eternity. Them entering this land, this promised land that was promised since their ancestors, living long in the land was the ultimate goal. For us, the ultimate goal is eternity. So I thought it was interesting, where like, I think as readers, we can easily limit the way that we read a passage or a group of readings because we are putting limits on what we think they are experiencing. They're experiencing entering into the promised land as what we say it would be eternity. And so we need to be more able to kind of step back from what they may be experiencing and realizing what the author in God ultimately, because he's the narrator from the beginning to the end of what's actually happening here. So I think that's a really good point. Where living long in the land was the goal.
Yep, and we do that all the time. You're spot on when you talk about us reading our own perspective back into what they were experiencing. And we think that just because we know something that they should have known something or would know something. And we were talking about this in the pre-talk, but one example that I've come across recently in some of my own readings outside the well, but For example, in C.S. Lewis's Reflections on the Psalms, he talks about this. But you get the sense that for us, eternity means, and eternal life means something specific, and it's tied to notions of heaven and hell. And that was well established by Jesus's time. We've talked about how the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection, the Pharisees did. And that was a not relatively new or novel development of Judaism through the Second Temple Judaic era and journey. But be that as it may, we're long before that, centuries before that time in the Torah and Deuteronomy, and then also you see this throughout the Psalms, which was mostly written by David and maybe a few other authors like Solomon, but mostly David around the year 1000 or so. And so this is long before the early first millennium, or sorry, late first millennium BC, when we get closer to Jesus's time. But the point being, in this time, they didn't have these concepts of eternal life and heaven and hell. They talked about the pit, or Sheol was the Hebrew concept for the place after death, and it had a lot of parallels to other pagan thoughts of the afterlife and where what was left of the person would go. And the most famous concept like this for us is the Greek religious concept of Hades. And of course, they had many gods in their pantheon, and they had concepts that the Hebrews of Judaism wouldn't have subscribed to. But the concepts of Hades and Sheol were very similar in the sense that these were where the afterlife happened, because this is where the soul, or what was left of the human, would go, and the vitality of life was bound up in the body. And when the body was gone, the person was a shade of what they were, their former selves. And C.S. Lewis talks about, why would God start them with that? Why wouldn't he start with concepts of the afterlife? And his contention was that gets in the way of your relationship with God. If you're just looking for the rewards of heaven and the avoidance of hell, and that's what your relationship with God is for. You're not loving God just for God. You're loving it to get something out of it.
That's a good point. That's true. I think that would be, love C.S. Lewis quotes.
Yeah, he's great.
I don't know how you memorize all those quotes. You always pull out these quotes out of nowhere. I'm like, how'd you do that?
Yeah. And how do you recognize some of the patterns and allegories in the Bible? I don't know how you do that.
Appreciate it.
Oh, we all bring strengths, right?
That's right. So as we entered into this section, one of the very first words we notice is this word listen. And so we've already talked about this briefly. We're going to see this word Shema a lot peppered throughout Deuteronomy. I mean, absolutely peppered. But this first section of Deuteronomy is chapters 1 through 11. Craigie mentioned that earlier. And within 1 through 11, it has 3 little sections, but I'm just going to take it as a whole. So I added it all up. Shema is mentioned over 35 times in this section, and the word love is mentioned 12 times. And so I thought that was really interesting. Listen and love, Shema are going to be anonymous with each other. And this word listen, as you read through here, it's going to be listen, it's going to be hear, it's also going to be the word obey. In Hebrew, there is no word for obey. So anytime in scripture in the Old Testament you see the word obey, like obey, O Israel, it's the word Shema. Wow. It's the word to hear. And so when the readers would read this word Shema, or the word listen or hear in our translations, they would hear it as to hear the Lord, to hear what he has to say. But it's more than just that. There's actually an action involved. It's almost like if I was walking in a forest and I hear something, right? Oh, I heard that. I shemad. I heard it. Yeah. But I decide to go towards the thing I heard. Let's say I heard a scream. So to shema is to hear it, but then I actually move towards the thing I heard. That's also shemaing. Wow. I hear it, but I also move towards it, right? And then when I get to the scream, I notice that there's somebody that's injured, right? And I actually take action. And that actually also means shema. So shema is more than just an ability to hear. It is to hear, take action, and obey, to follow through with the thing you heard. So when you're reading through these sections, and every time you see the word listen, hear, and obey, I have them all highlighted in purple in my Bible right now. I just want you to know that those are all shema, same concept.
That's really cool. And we see this concept of also, why am I going into the land? God is setting up through the commands of Moses that they're going into the land to, as you said, to live long, and we covered that. There's also this concept of remembering so that you may live well. And I think that there's a concept, or there's this thought of when we remember, we've heard it initially, but then we have to remember to reflect on it to carry that forward with us and make it part of who we are. But then we have to teach our children, which we get into in these chapters as well. And actually, so we're starting in chapter 3, going through verse 22 of chapter 4, we have a chiasm. And I'm not going to diagram it all out. That's beyond the scope of the class, as they say here. But one of the things that we've actually learned in our Sunday school class, thank you, Suzanne Scott, you taught me this. But as you look at a chiasm, the ancient Hebrew writers use them to teach. They use them to embed kind of pearls or nuggets that they wanted the reader to pull out. And they would embed it in the exact middle place of the chiasm. So you take the beginning and the end and kind of whittle it down. And by at least the way I calculated it, or kind of tracked it down this week, chapter 4, verse 9, in this chiasm is the middle. Watch yourselves closely so that you do not forget the things that your eyes have seen, or let them fade from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to their children after them. So God is calling out to Israel and to us as his people, that he's taught us some things. There's been stories that have happened for our benefit. We need to remember them and pull them forward, appropriate them for us, and then teach them to our children so they don't forget either. And so there's this concept that runs through Baptist theology and throughout Baptist history, William McClendon being one of the main thoughts on this thread, thinkers on this thread. And we've talked about this before in this podcast, but the concept of then is now, and that is this. In other words, what's happened before is being pulled forward and being appropriated for us by the remembering. Remembering is in our mind, but also remembering, re-membering. We're re-stitching together the body or the story for ourselves, and it's becoming ours. And then similarly, reciprocally, we are being stitched into the story. We're becoming part of the story. We're putting ourselves back in time when it happened, and it's all collapsing on itself. And it's very sacramental, the sense that time and space is collapsing in on God, and we're being made one. We're being made part of the story, but the story is being made part of us, and we carry it with us.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And just to hone in on this is not just a concept that we have come up with. Like you said, it's so much in scripture, to the point that Moses actually says it really clearly in chapter 5. At the beginning of chapter 5, right before he talks about the revisiting of the 10 commandments, he talks about that verse 2 is the Lord God made a covenant with us. You're like, wait a second, with us? I thought that was with their parents, right? The first generation. This is the second generation. Here in Hebron. Hebron is just Mount Sinai. It's the same thing. Not with your fathers did the Lord make the covenant. Wait, I thought it was with the fathers. I'm confused, right? But with us, who are all of us here alive today. So the Lord spoke with you to your face to face. Like he's basically saying, I know your fathers in the first generations were the ones at Mount Sinai who literally saw the fire and heard God's own words. That was them. But Moses saying, don't be confused. That's you.
Yeah.
It's as if you were there face to face. You made this covenant. God made this covenant with you, and you were there. And so Moses is interesting how he does this, because throughout all of the Deuteronomy scroll, you're confused. Is he talking about the old generation, the current generation, or is he talking about me?
Yeah.
Because I wasn't at Mount Sinai, but neither were they. I wasn't there to hear his words, but I've read his words. Yep. I wasn't there to have that covenant with the blood sprinkled on top of me, but I've made a covenant with God now. And so I think we're supposed to imagine the Deuteronomy scroll, these retelling of these laws are not just for this generation entering in the promised land, it's for us too. And I think that Moses is brilliant in the way that he says his sermons.
Yep,
yeah.
Totally agree.
Good.
And I forgot to say this when it comes to the chiasm, but just for the benefit of the leader, we know it's a chiasm because starting in 3:25, Moses is complaining about not being able to go into the promised land. And in verse 4, the part of chapter 4 that ends in verse 22, he's complaining again. And basically God says, get over it. I don't want to hear about it again. Right? It kind of sounds harsh when we hear that coming from God, but God's heard enough of Moses' complaining. It's time to move on.
He's like, I've heard it.
Yeah.
All right, buddy. I say this to my kids all the time. Like this is what I tell my kids all the time. They say it and they've asked and asked. I was like, you've asked.
Yep.
I've made an answer.
You've heard the answer.
Yeah.
It's time to move
You've
on.
asked. There's been an answer.
Yep.
We're done. I've said that with my kids. Interestingly, as and back up chapter 4 again, it's interesting how God makes such a big point to talk about right after verse 9. You're talking about verse 9, how it is a pivotal part of the section. Right after that, he talks about, as we're telling our children, he's saying, when we were all there at Mount Sinai, and you heard my words, it says, but saw no form. It's really important to understand how he keeps talking about how he saw no form. And then right after that, the next section, he's talking about the forms that we're going to try to make idols out of. And so we're going to make idols out of wood and out of different things that are handmade. And it's interesting, things that look like male and female. Don't make things that are winged birds, or the likeness of man, or things that creepy crawly on the ground. That's my version, creepy crawly. And then the things that are in the fish in the sea. And also beware when you raise your eyes, not to be when you see the sun and the moon and the stars. And then it also says all the host of heaven. That's interesting. That word host of heavens is could be translated as armies of angels.
Wow.
Angels, armies. So it's saying that even when we look up into the sky and we see the sun, moon, and stars, he's not saying sun, moon, and stars, and those are the host of heavens. He's saying, and the host of heavens, which are like the angels, do not bow down to them. And then right after that, in verse 20, has a little interesting phrase. And I looked at multiple, at the end of verse 19, I looked at multiple commentaries, make sure I didn't see this wrong. But after it talks about the host of heavens, it says, you be drawn away and bow down to them or serve them. He's talking about all the things that we will make idols out of. And the Lord your God has allotted to all the people under the whole earth, under the whole heaven. And so it sounds like it's saying that God has created these hosts of angels he's allotted them to serve us. We're not supposed to bow down to them. They're supposed to serve us. He's allotted them to us. That's amazing.
But just as any sin, which is an inversion of anything that God has given us, we've taken it and perverted it. Just
Yes.
Same here. We are now
Yeah.
bowing down to the creation.
We
We're now bowing down to those who God set up to serve us. Now we want to serve them.
Yeah, this whole list is actually a mirroring of creation.
Yeah.
And when you look at it, it's exactly the opposite of how creation was created in order. It actually is the exact opposite. It talks about man first and works his way backwards. So pay attention to that.
That's
I
so
love
interesting.
things like that.
Yeah.
Right after that, it talks about how this whole Shema, to love and to hear. I mean, to hear is to love, and to love is to hear. What's interesting is it talks about how all these gods that you have, it says they cannot hear or see or eat or smell, but your God Shemas. Wow. So not only are we supposed to listen and obey, but Yahweh is the only God who actually listens back. He's
Yep.
the only one. No other God, because they're made out of wood, remember? Things, handmade things. They cannot hear or smell or taste or see, but your God sees you and hears you. So if you listen and obey him, he will hear you.
Yep.
And Moses actually makes a point to say, remember, this all started because your Yahweh heard your ancestors crying out in Egypt.
Wow.
It says he cried out and God heard them. And that's what started this where they got to this place.
Started their journey to here, and it'll propel them forward.
It will.
Yeah.
Do you have anything for 5 or 6 before we move on?
Yeah, I would say in 5, we're kind of looking at the chapter as a whole. It's a retelling of the 10 Commandments, right? Mostly the same as we got in Exodus 20. What I looked at the two side by side, and it's mostly word for word. Some of the differences show up mostly in the commandment about the Sabbath in Exodus 20. The reason for keeping the Sabbath is really tied more towards creation, and because God rested on the 7th day. Here in Deuteronomy 5, it's more tied to the Exodus, and you're observing the Sabbath because God led you out of Egypt and gave you rest in the land, which they're about to take, and rest because of who you are in God, and you rest because God has made you an image of himself, and you're worthy because of that. And it's about who you are, not what you do. In Egypt, it was all about what they did, and they baked clay and they baked bricks to earn their keep, and they produced to kind of earn their keep and be worthy of continued existence as a slave. Here, they're worthy because of who they are and that God has adopted them. So that's a big difference that is called out in the Ten Commandments. And again, I didn't read this anywhere, but I think it's because it's that Deuteronomy theme and Moses's continued hammering of you are who you are because of God, and you are who you are because of what God has called you to. There is that mission that God has laid upon Israel again, that vocation to be the witnesses to the peoples of the earth about who God is and who a people of God is called to be in the world. They're set apart to be holy, but they have to remember that. And to remember that, they have to remember who God is and who they are.
This section right here, it starts out chapter 10, the first verse there. And once again, you have Shema, O Israel, the statutes and the rules that I have spoken to you today. What's interesting about that word statutes, when I looked at it, that word statutes literally means to cut into, or it's like he literally cut a covenant with. And what I was reminded of is when after the Ten Commandments was told, Moses goes up and literally the finger of God cut these words into the tablet. So I thought that was really interesting that this word statutes here literally means to cut a covenant, to cut into something.
It's amazing how those threads continue to play through.
It does. And it's almost like today we would say it's like set in stone. When something's like when you set in stone, that's kind of this concept we have here.
Yeah, like these are fundamental rules for living that aren't going to change because it's just part of how creation is made and what it means to be human.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really what this is. I've heard the Ten Commandments called the owner's manual for being human.
I haven't heard that before. I love it. I guess the only other thing I had this section here is I think something that's sometimes hard for people to grasp the concept is if you read these things carefully, some people can struggle here with how is a God having them go in and just utterly destroy. We're going to get into some more of this. Utterly destroy these people. And you were just talking about this thread, and that's what made me think of it. This thread. We have to remember that everything here has been kind of restructured. The Genesis 1-9 over and over again, right?
It's called out that creation pattern continues repeating.
Yeah, it keeps repeating. And the very first time we see this mention of giants is right before the flood narrative.
Yep.
And
Genesis 6, I believe.
Yeah, it is Genesis 6. And it is one of those sections where it's mentioned briefly, but it's because of the destruction of the people. The people are actually self-destructing themselves. They're killing each other. God just speeds it up by having judgment come up and over onto the land into a flood, and that's the flood narrative. So you have this first mention of these giants, these Nephilim is another way of saying it, these giant warrior men, and they're mentioned again in Exodus when the spies go out into the land. They keep seeing these giants. They're literally the Amorites. The Amorites come from a line of Canaan, which the Canaan is the son of Noah, that did the thing we're not supposed to know about that happened in the tent after the flood, because God has the righteous remnant. He has judgment upon his people. That's the decreation. The righteous remnant was Noah. Noah goes and immediately plants a garden. Oh, you're like, oh, it's Eden again. Or plants a garden. And then he eats from the garden. He's supposed to. Adam is supposed to eat from the garden, right? He eats from the garden, but then he gets junk on it. And he gets naked. You're like, oh, I've been here before. And then something sketchy happens. And out of that something sketchy happens is his son. And out of that son was a seed. And that seed came Canaan. And out of Canaan's line comes these giants. You're supposed to imagine, once again, you have this self-destructing humans who are just gonna are utterly evil. And so when you think of God's people entering into the promised land and destroying this people, it's almost like Israel is like a flood going in and having God's judgment over the people who are just destroying themselves anyways. And you have these giants. I think that's why the giants are re-mentioned over and over again, because we're supposed to imagine them. You're supposed to have had the Noah story in your mind.
Yep.
It's fascinating.
So they're cleaning the land through God's justice, in the sense that Israel is part of their job of being a missional people of God, of being a people witnessing for God, is to be his justice and embody his justice.
And because they're listening and obeying,
Yep.
right? You're shemaing and loving God. And in that way, they're going in and going against the people who are not listening and obeying God.
Well, this is really cool. So now the people of God are the flood.
That's exactly what I know. That's what I envision in my head.
One before we move on to Psalm, I would call out one last thing. Deuteronomy biblical scholar Christopher Wright had the following observation on the Shema. And I'll say the Shema as compared to what Amber has rightly called out the word listen in Hebrew is Shema, but you'll hear a lot of scholars, especially in Judaism, talk about the Shema.
The Shema prayer.
And usually they usually mean Deuteronomy 6, verse 4 and following. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. On that verse, Christopher Wright writes the following. Let me just read because it's a great quote I can't possibly do justice to other than just by reading it. The challenge, listen, Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh one. That's in quotes. That's his translation. Let me say it again. Listen, Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh one. You'll notice there is no verbs in there. And Christopher Wright calls this out. He goes on to say, this translation is a central expectation of Old Testament faith. In Judaism, it is known by the word for listen. It is the Shema, like I just said. He goes on to say, it is the central affirmation of Orthodox Jewish faith. As a sentence, Yahweh our God, Yahweh one works in Hebrew as it doesn't work in English. Hebrew doesn't have a word for is, and you can have a sentence of this kind without a verb. In this one, there are several places where you could put an is to produce a proper English sentence. Wherever you do so, it is clear where the emphasis lies. There is a repeating of the name Yahweh, then the declaration that this God is our God. Then the declaration is that closing word one. So the emphasis is on it all. We're not trying to put emphasis on either his oneness or God or Yahweh himself. It's a package together, which is a lot of the flexibility you get in the original Hebrew that you might lose in some English translation. So I thought that was important to call out.
Yeah, I saw that the word one in Hebrew could either have a compound, it's a compound word, or it's an absolute. And this word used here for one is the absolute version of that, which also adds more to what you were just saying.
Actually, yes. It's fantastic.
And heart, soul, and might, these are interesting words. Heart means mind and will. It means mind and will. Soul is all encompassing, like every ounce. And then might actually means muchness. With all of your muchness.
That's awesome.
I thought that was the coolest way of saying it.
That's cool.
With all of your muchness. Awesome. Craig, you had something for Psalms 44 for us.
Yes.
Today.
So as I get there real quick, this is a great psalm, and it's a little bit of a different psalm than we've seen in the previous 43 psalms. It kind of inverts the normal psalm pattern that we've seen of the psalmist is lamenting, and he's feeling the absence of God, and then he kind of gets himself to a point, either through feeling God's presence or just remembering who God is, of getting into a better place, remembering that God is there and that he has this ultimate salvation in God. It's almost the reverse of that, it feels like, in this psalm. We start off very much seeing the praise of God and the history of God's people and what God has done for his people and the victories in God. And then we get to verse 8, you sense a shift. In God we make our boast all day long, and we will praise your name forever. And then it starts to talk about how they've been rejected. And then in verse 17, the psalmist says, all this came upon us, though we had not forgotten you. We had not been false to your covenant. I'm thinking, really? I mean, we've already seen a lot of times already, golden calf, they didn't go into the promised land when they said or when God told them to, and when Moses said they should. So they're already falling down on the job where we're at in our own journey in the well. But if you read the whole Old Testament, you know that they ultimately are very unfaithful to God multiple times. He gives them multiple chances. The Assyrians come in and conquer the northern kingdom. The Babylonians come in and conquer what's left of the southern kingdom, haul them off into exile into Babylon. And the Babylonian, those in the Babylonian exile, which is that time period is what it's known as, they get this ultimate sense of reading back on their history that they were unfaithful to God. They were again, I hate to use this phraseology and this imagery, but the Bible uses it. They're harlots, they're whores, and unfaithful to God in the spiritual sense. And so this comes out in the sense that they forgot who God was. They were unfaithful to God. And so God punished them by having them lose the land. Again, calling back to what we said in Deuteronomy, their call by God was to be faithful, remember who they are, remember who God is, so that they could live long and inhabit the good land, the promised land. They lose the land. We know that, spoiler alert, I apologize. But here in the Psalm, the psalmist is saying, verse 17, we have not forgotten you. We were faithful to the covenant. We know that that's not true. So it just struck me that the psalmist is lamenting what we know is not, he knows this, even if this is David in the year 1000, before all that happened, before the Assyrians and the Babylonians, they'd already been unfaithful. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. I read it too, and I was like, this is odd that after verse 8, I thought it was going to be this praise and this Thanksgiving psalm, and then it says but, and I was like, what's the but going to be about? And it went from like triumph to weeping.
Yeah,
it was an interesting flip for me, and it struck me as odd, and I'm wondering if maybe, like you said, that maybe David much later, and David's reflecting back on all the stories he heard of what we're reading here in Deuteronomy and what we're going to get into into Joshua next. Or the conquering is going to happen with Joshua when we get there. It's almost like he's reflecting on all the things that God did for them, and he's maybe not feeling it himself. Like maybe he's just not, I've reflected upon all the things you've done, and I haven't felt it. I'm weeping. I feel triumph of what you've done for your people, but what about me? I'm not feeling that right now. I'm feeling really lost.
Great point.
And so I thought that was interesting. And I also love how I love this so much. How certain things are written. So verse 2 struck me and stood out to me. It says, if you, verse 2, and with your own hand drove out the nations. That's what we're about to do here. We're about to watch happen.
Yep.
It says, but them you planted. What he's saying is Israel did not go into the land on their own terms. It's like God literally lifted them and planted them into Canaan. But when I read that, it struck me because it's exactly what happens with Adam and Eve. Yep. So God created a garden. And then inside of that land of Eden was a garden. Adam was actually created outside of the garden from the dust. And it says that he was actually planted into the garden. And so it's a very similar image. I see that this new Eden land, this new Eden, which is going to be a diminished version of the real first Eden. It's a diminished version, but it's what best we can do here on earth after our fallen world. A diminished version is here in Canaan. They literally, it's almost like Adam, once again, they're being planted into the promised land, the new Eden. I thought that was really beautiful imagery.
That's fascinating. It's almost like every iteration of this creation, humans mess up, decreation, creation against cycle.
Yes.
It's almost every time we go through this, it's diminished. The quality is
it can never be what it was originally. Since the fall. It cannot be, but God does the best he can to make, especially the temple, make it as beautiful as he could, as like the closest you can get to heaven, closest you can get to God's midst.
I was just thinking of this picture here in the promised land in general compared to what we just went through in Exodus with the tabernacle and the what you call it, the mobile city.
The mobile tent. tent. I also thought in verse 5 it says, though there you pushed down your foes. That word push down literally means to toss into the air like a horned animal would do. So think of an ox running in and they're tossing someone in the air. Like, have you ever been?
It's like our bullfights.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. Think of like the clowns and how they just purposely the bulls just go and poke them and they fly up in the air. That's literally the word there. Yeah. That's the image this psalmist has for God going in. He pushed over the foes like a horned animal, just tossing them like they're nothing.
He goes on to say, "I put no trust in my bow. My sword does not bring me victory." So he's saying it's not our ability. It's you, God.
Yeah, it's not by your strength or by your skill. Yeah, I love it. Such an interesting psalm.
Yeah, that's cool.
I think that's all in Psalms 44.
Yeah, so it's shifting to Mark 16. We're in the last chapter of Mark here, and Mark ends up. We get into the first 8 verses of chapter 16, and Jesus is risen. The women don't know that yet. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, 3 women who have been following Jesus probably since his ministry started. They're coming to the tomb to prepare his body for burial with spices. And the thing that they're doing is they're preparing his body for burial in the ossuary. So, the tomb wasn't meant to be the body's final resting place. The Jewish culture was to take the body, the remains, and put them in an ossuary. Kind of you've probably seen the TV documentaries on the famous one that they found a few years ago. But these ossuaries of bones that they find in archaeological digs. So that's what is coming into play here. At least that's what they think is going to happen. But they get to the tomb. Lo and behold, the stone is rolled away. The body of Jesus is not there. And the man, an angel, says in verse 6, don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He's not here. But basically, he goes on to say, go and tell the disciples and Peter. It's interesting, and Peter. He is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you'll see him just as he told you. So he said where he's going to be. And we get an ending here. At the verse 8, the women are trembling and they're bewildered and they're basically afraid, and it says they don't say anything. So you get an ending here. And before we get into the next verses, I want to give you a chance to make a couple of observations as well, Amber.
Yeah, this is so interesting. The first thing is just that reminder. We mentioned it when we did Mark chapter 1, when we were talking about Mark and how he wrote his gospel with an eyewitness testimony as its main focus. So, and we know that Peter was his main eyewitness, and some people wonder how we know that. And it was, and I made a point back when we started Mark chapter 1. I guess that was 16 weeks ago.
Oh,
So we're doing one
it's
a
hard
week.
to believe.
I know, it's hard to imagine because I just feel like we just talked about this.
Yeah.
But Peter was his main eyewitness, and we know that because ancient documents, not just writings, not just the scriptures, use this special thing called inclusio. And what they do is they're kind of input something at the very beginning and something at the very end to kind of, and to say, here's the author. And some people, and so other people have done this, but here Mark is doing this for Peter. So Mark chapter 1 has a little special, interesting section about having Peter twice. Let's go back to it. Yeah, I saw you flipping. I thought that was a good idea. He talks about passing alongside the Sea of Galilee. He saw Simon, which will be Peter, and Andrew, the brother of Simon. Well, in normal English, you would say Simon and his brother Andrew.
Yeah.
But the author, Mark, intentionally put Simon. So basically it says Simon.
That's cool.
Well, what happened here, it says, go tell the disciples. Well, who was part of the disciples? Peter, which is Simon, all right? And then it says, and Peter. So this is basically saying Peter.
Yeah.
And so this is Mark's really unique, fun way of saying Peter is his main eyewitness testimony for the whole Gospel of Mark.
It's also interesting that you could take a different lens to this too and say Peter just got done denying the Lord 3 times before the cock crowed twice, and he's in a sense outside the circle of disciples, and he needs to be restored. And we see that happen in other gospels, that Jesus restores him in his resurrection body before the ascension. So we'll get to that, but it's an interesting foreshadowing of that too.
Yeah.
I don't know if Mark meant that, but that's
interesting.
One lens I brought to it. But you're probably right that his formal reason for this is inclusio.
Yeah. What's interesting, because now and also people wonder why all of a sudden all the women named. And it's not that the women haven't been around. In fact, they are around. In chapter 15, he actually gives a little piece of this where it says, at the end, it says, verse 41, when he was in Galilee, so when he was in Galilee before he came to Jerusalem, they followed him and they ministered to him, and there were many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. So there's a little mention of the women there, that there's many women who have been following Jesus this whole time, which is not common for rabbis back then to have female disciples, but Jesus seemed to have that. But why weren't they not mentioned before? Well, because they were not the eyewitness testimony. Now Peter's gone.
Yeah.
The main eyewitness testimony person is now missing. He's missing in action, literally. And so the only people here left are the women. This is why now the women's names are so crucial and so important. And there were probably more women around, but the reasons why these are mentioned just like multiple times in Mark, where you're like, why is that random person named? Is because they named the people that his readers would have known. So these people were probably known to the Roman readers at this time. If the readers did not know who the person was, he usually would just say the woman, or like the, whatever, the different things. So he wouldn't use their names. He used their names intentionally. Also,
it's like we might say, if you don't know that Bill Harris is the cashier at 7-Eleven that I had a conversation with when I bought my Slurpee after church today, I might just say, hey, when I met the cashier at 7-Eleven, this is what happened.
But if I knew Bill Harris, I'd be like, guess who I saw? I saw Bill Harris get my slushie today. What kind of slushie did you get?
Yeah, I didn't actually guess.
Oh,
I just made that up. I got coffee.
I did
get a cherry one yesterday.
Okay, cherry slushie. Now we know Craig's order.
Yes.
Slushie, got it. Cherry slushie.
Teeth, though, not good for the podcast.
We just derailed. Okay. Okay, the other thing about the women I thought was so interesting is the women being the main eyewitness testimony to the resurrection, which we know the resurrection is the very thing Christianity lives and dies on.
Yep.
Without the resurrection, Christianity is nothing.
Yep.
I think it's Paul.
tells us as
Yeah,
much.
I think it's Paul says that. Thank you.
Yep.
You were reading my mind. Interestingly, the early church would have thought the women being the main eyewitness testimonies for the resurrection would have been an embarrassment, absolute embarrassment. They were not used as credible sources in the early church. So
And that's not just because the Jewish people were misogynists. That the entire ancient world did this. At least the Greeks and the Romans had the same attitude towards women.
Absolutely, this is that. And so the early church would have been embarrassed to have these women. And so what's interesting about that today we can look at it and actually see it as more of evidence, as like great evidential proof to the truthfulness of the resurrection, because you won't make this up.
Amen.
The early writers would never have made this up. Right. In fact, you have Gnostic gospels, these are Gnostic writers who wrote many years later, who are trying to make it sound like this is legit. They will use things like the high priest, and they'll use all these credible sources, and apparently they were all sleeping by the tomb. And the reason they do that is because they're very convenient. They're using that because they would have been credible sources where the women were not. And so this was almost, for us, gives almost more credibility to the truthfulness of the resurrection. The very thing that Christianity lives and dies on are on these women's testimony.
Point being, if you're going to make up a religion, and even if you wanted to have resurrection based on eyewitnesses, you wouldn't write it with women because they weren't trusted. They weren't the witnesses with authority and authenticity you went to, because nobody believes a woman. Why would you believe a woman? So for the writers to lay it out exactly like this, they couldn't make it up because they wouldn't think it would be accepted. So they're writing what happened. They're writing what they experienced,
which I think is beautiful.
Yeah,
it's awesome.
Right, it does add to the authenticity of exactly what we're reading.
It's not legend. If I was making a legend, I would use all the things that make it look good.
Yep, exactly.
As we continue on from verse 9 to the end of this chapter, a lot of scholars call this the longer ending. The longer ending, you'll see some parentheses here on this. You had some insight on this longer ending.
Yeah, so it's very jarring when you go beyond verse 8 and into 9 through 20. Those last 12 verses you're almost like it's a phase shift or something. You're in a different story or a different gospel maybe, or a different commentary, and you're like, wait, what just happened? I was reading one style and you immediately sense a shift. I never really paid attention to the difference in styles between these last 12 verses and the rest of the Gospel of Mark, because honestly, this journey through this journey through Mark that we've taken as part of the Bible Journey reading program has forced us to look week by week at what is Mark doing, and that's been a great gift. And when you do that, you see, as you've seen the journey with us, you see why this is so jarring when you read these verses. So
it doesn't sound like his voice at all.
Yeah, and the style is different. The literary tools that Mark has been using throughout are not here. And the point of these last 12 verses is almost different than what Mark's point has been all throughout. So what they're doing in these last 12 verses is almost a summary of Christianity. And most scholars think it was written 100 or 200 years after Mark, because these 12 verses are not in the earliest manuscripts of Mark that we have, but they are in later ones. So they think that they were just added by a copyist probably, or some of the early church fathers who were embarrassed or nervous about this being the ending of Mark, verse 8 being the ending of Mark. But again, there's nothing wrong with what's in these verses. It's very scriptural, but it's probably not the ending of Mark, is my point. So, in my Bible, they're italicized, right? And the Bibles usually these days are going to make that distinction. So that led me to ask if Mark did end at 8, or the fact that we do have the ending at 8, this is God's word. So what's he trying to tell us? What's he trying to communicate? So a couple of things. We don't know if Mark just ended it here, or if part of, maybe Mark had a conclusion that was lost. That's possible. We don't know. We're not going to know this side of heaven. But what we do know is if it ends at 8, the women are left in a position of failure or of unfaithfulness or unbelief, because they're not doing what they've been commanded to do. They've been commanded to go and tell the disciples and Peter that Jesus is running ahead of them and will meet them in Galilee. They're trembling. They've been told not to be alarmed. They're afraid and they're not saying anything. Then they're silent. So all that to say that Mark is ending it on a note where we ourselves, based on that then is now and that is this concept that we were talking about in Deuteronomy, we're now in here too. We're being appropriated and grafted into the story, and the story becomes ours, and we become part of the story. We aren't being invited to run ahead and see Jesus in Galilee and to tell the disciples and ultimately be the disciples. And as we get into Acts, and as the story of the church continues, the story of Mark continues. And maybe Mark didn't want his ending to be there because he doesn't want there to be an ending, because we are the continuation.
That's interesting. Yeah, I love what you had to say about that. And as you were talking, I was kind of reminded as I was reading through this section, you were just saying how Mark seems to maybe have ended with maybe some disbelief, right? Some unfaithfulness. But these next sections here, if you actually go a verse by verse study of them, this first paragraph here is a witness, a report, and a disbelief. The next section is the two men, right? It's a witness, a report, and disbelief. And the next section is Jesus appearing to the 11 and then rebuking for their unbelief. And so it's interesting that the person who did somebody who, this is not Mark's voice, ended this section actually almost dealt with the very thing that you felt uncomfortable about. Or apparently they did too. That's interesting.
And they just couldn't leave it alone, right? And there's obviously other gospels that we have that tell us where, even if this was Mark's ending, it's not the end of the story that we know. The other gospels witness the resurrection. They have witnesses to the resurrection. They have witnesses to the ascension. They have witnesses to what Jesus did in the resurrection body. So just because Mark ends there doesn't mean we don't know what happens. It's just with dealing with what Mark felt like he needed to communicate. He was either done or he was almost done. So it's just an interesting conundrum. This is still, it's obviously God's word, and God has things to teach us. And even the last 12 verses are the scriptural voice. I say the scriptural voice as opposed to Mark's voice because this is still God giving us words. But just have awareness of what you're reading and why. It makes a difference.
It does. I think this brings up some people's issues with like, well, oh my gosh, this isn't Mark's word. It's in Mark's gospel. Now I can't trust anything. Like, and this should not be this should not be a stumbling block to our faith. Nothing that is said here is nothing that's not scriptural. It is absolutely scriptural. It is God's intention. It is there for a purpose and a reason. In fact, it actually brings a lot of clarity to some things we're going to be reading in other gospels and in Acts as well. So that's a good point. And as we wrap up today, if you have anything else before we wrap up,
I think I'm good.
That's a good conversation today. It was great. I loved it. Once again, let us know about this setup, if you like the setup or not. But as we end and send you off with this week's reading, I was reminded this week as I was reflecting on the burial, the cross and the burial. And then in my Bible, there's like the tiniest little gap of white spot between Jesus's burial and the resurrection. And that little bitty spot is very small in my Bible, but I was just reflecting on the fact that his disciples, the people who've been following this whole time, what hopelessness might have felt like between the tomb and the resurrection, between the cross and the tomb, I should say. What hopelessness. And I know that there's times that we can feel hopeless, but just like we're going to read on into the Gospels, we can trust God. We can trust him even in the hopelessness. They didn't understand it. They didn't see it, but we can trust him through it because of the words written in this section and beyond, because of all the goodness he has done for us. So when you feel like you're in that little space, and maybe that space is bigger in your Bible or in your heart, in your life, just know you can trust God and that he has a word for you and he is good. So we send you out this week. I hope you were blessed this week through this week's readings, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
See you next time.